Good morning, and it's good to be back with you again this morning. Let me add my welcome to Eric's, and if you are joining us for the first time or you've started to join us during this period of lockdown or you're a regular member of our church family, I want to add my welcome this morning. Today we begin a new teaching series which we've entitled The Prodigal God. It's a series which is inspired by the little book by Tim Keller of the same title. It's a great book which I really recommend to you, that takes an in-depth look at the story that so many of us know as the story of the prodigal son. Over the next 4 Sundays, we're going to dig a little deeper into this really familiar story. The story of the prodigal son is a story that's found its way into our everyday language. The word prodigal, according to one of the dictionary definitions which I came across this week, literally means a person who spends or has spent his or her money or substance with a wasteful extravagance, a spendthrift. We sometimes use the term the prodigals to describe our children who've lost their way as prodigal sons and daughters. And of course, we're all familiar with the idea of the fattened calf, which comes right out of this story. The celebration meal. For years, when I used to return to Dublin to friends that I grew up with, there was a very special couple that I used to visit on every occasion that I could. And they always had this joke running that whenever I returned, they were going to provide me with a meal, which they always described as the fattened calf. Ironically, it normally turned out to be a leg of lamb, which I have to say I really enjoyed. But there was always that sense of returning home to the city where I grew up, and that sense of celebrating a great meal with those I loved. A meal that was always full of fun and laughter and reminiscing. The challenge we face when we come to a familiar story is that we tend to zone out a little bit because of our familiarity. And my prayer has been and will be that we will see and feel and discover things in this story that we haven't seen before. That we will see that this is much more than just the story of a returning prodigal son who is embraced and reinstated by a loving father. And that we will see a story where Jesus challenges our fundamental assumptions about God and what it means to be deeply lost and truly found. We're going to discover that the story of the prodigal son is actually the story of 2 lost sons, one who is found and the other whose plight is deliberately left hanging by Jesus. And thinking about how we might approach this well-known story, my thoughts were drawn to Rembrandt's famous painting entitled The Return of the Prodigal Son. It's a huge 8-foot by 6-foot painting that hangs in the Hermitage Art Gallery in St. Petersburg. It's a painting that seems to capture so much. It's painted in such a way that the focus is drawn to the father's hands of welcome and acceptance as the penitent and disheveled younger son kneels in front of his father. It is a profoundly moving picture of coming home to the father. It's a picture of forgiveness and reconciliation and healing. I'm not sure how well you can see the picture on the screen this morning, but there are in fact 4 other figures who all represent different ways of observing this scene from a distance. There are 2 women standing behind the father at different distances. There is a seated man staring into space and looking at no one in particular, and there's a tall man at the front who's clearly the elder son in the story, standing upright and looking critically over the events in front of him. And each of these characters seem to represent different ways of not getting too involved in this story. The various postures that they've adopted are very telling. The 2 women are standing in the background. The man is sitting with his arms crossed. The elder son is standing there with his hands gripping each other. And the question that I want us to reflect on as we come into this new mini teaching series is, where would you place yourself in this picture? Do you place yourself as an observer or as a participant? Henry Nouwen, in his book entitled The Return of the Prodigal Son, speaks of his task as a lecturer and how for years he played the part of an observer to this story, but confesses how his intellectual and his academic approach to the Christian faith prevented him from entering into the centre of this story and allowing him to be held by a forgiving God. He writes these powerful and very challenging words of personal testimony. I so much wanted to keep some control over my spiritual journey, to remain able to predict at least a part of the outcome, that relinquishing the security of the observer for the vulnerability of the returning son seemed close to impossible. And yet the story of Henry Nouwen is that of an observer who becomes a participant, which in his own words turned out to be the beginning of my own return. Next Sunday morning, we're going to begin a much closer look at the story of the prodigal son, or to be more accurate, the story of the two lost sons. This morning, our task is to take a look at the setting of this story as we explore these powerful themes of lost and found that we heard in our Bible reading a few minutes ago this morning. So if you've got a Bible to hand, I want to encourage you to open it with me at Luke chapter 15 this morning. If you look at verses 1 and 2, you'll see immediately that Luke introduces us to two very distinctively different groups of people who are gathering around Jesus. One group is identified for us by Luke as the tax collectors and the sinners. The other group he describes are the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. And it's this religious group that gives us our title for this morning. He welcomes sinners and eats with them. The groups are gathering, and Luke wants us to understand that they are growing in number. There is an attraction to the person and the teaching of Jesus. And the Pharisees and the religious leaders and the teachers of the law are deeply unhappy about what is going on. They're muttering, they're complaining, they're probably feeling quite threatened by Jesus. Because as far as they are concerned, they are the ones who have the monopoly on God. They are the ones who keep the law. They are the ones whom God should accept and welcome. It seems, if you look at verse 2 with me, that they are especially offended because Jesus not only welcomes sinners, but he eats with them. Something that even today is seen in Middle Eastern custom as a sign of friendship and acceptance. And Jesus responds to their questions and to their mutterings by telling these three powerful little stories or parables where the purpose is to challenge the Pharisees' understanding of who God is and how God operates in his world. So that when we get to the last story, the story of the two lost sons, Jesus includes both the sinners and the religious people in a story that becomes the final part of Jesus' answer. That's yet to come. So for now, let's begin by noticing how Jesus responds to the mutterings and the complaints of these religious leaders. Three things I want you to notice with me this morning. And here's the first one. Jesus begins by showing both them and us that without a relationship with God, we are all lost. You can follow that theme of getting lost or getting separated through these three little stories. If you look at verse 4, it's a sheep that gets separated from the rest of the flock. In verse 8, it's a coin that gets separated from the rest of the coins. And as we shall see from next week onwards, in verse 11, it's a child who makes a deliberate decision to walk out on his father. Getting lost can be a frightening and even dangerous experience depending on your circumstances. I can still remember vividly getting separated from my parents on the London Underground, and I must have been about the age of 6 or 7. I can even now, as I recount the story, remember that sense of rising panic and fear. Thankfully, it didn't last for long, but from a child's perspective, it felt like it lasted forever. But it wasn't a pleasant experience. But Jesus isn't speaking about that kind of getting lost in these stories. He's talking about something much deeper. He is talking about how it feels to be separated from the living God. He's speaking about a deep sense of vulnerability that comes when we decide to go our own way. Jesus is describing here in picture language about how it feels when we lose contact with the living God, and that it is something that affects every aspect of our lives. And in these three stories, Jesus is describing that loss of contact. In the first story, a valuable sheep gets separated from the rest of the flock. In the second story, a coin becomes lost when it gets separated from the rest of the coins. And in the most powerful story, a son separates himself from his father and his family when he deliberately decides to walk out on his family. Which brings us back to the very heart of what Jesus wants to teach us about God from these stories. That without a relationship with the living God, we are spiritually lost. We are like a lost sheep. We are like a lost coin. We are like a lost son who chooses to go his own way. And yet they are lost in quite different ways, aren't they? The sheep gets lost through its own foolishness. The coin is lost through thoughtlessness. And the son through a deliberate act of rebellion. So as Jesus begins to answer the criticisms and the mutterings of the religious leaders, he gives both them and us a much wider and more comprehensive definition of sin than the one that the Pharisees had come up with at the start of this chapter. As we learn that whether we're the most religious people in the world or the worst sinners, that without a relationship with the living God, we are spiritually lost, that we cannot save ourselves, that we cannot find our own way back to God. But secondly, and here comes the great news that Jesus came to announce, that lost people really matter to God. Here is something that takes us to the very heartbeat of the Christian faith. No wonder people were gathering around Jesus. They had never heard anything like this before. Now, one of the religious leaders were muttering, you see, Jesus came to announce that you and I are deeply loved by God. Or as we often say here in this church, that there is nothing that you and I can do that will make God love us any more. And there is nothing that you and I can do that will make God love us any less. Why? Because people really matter to God. That's why many of the people who were listening to Jesus telling these stories needed to hear, rather that's what they needed to hear. Back in verses 1 and 2, they're surrounded by a group of religious leaders who acted as if they had it all sorted, who believed they knew exactly what kind of people God would accept. And it certainly didn't include the tax collectors and the sinners. And perhaps it's hard for us this morning to comprehend the impact of Jesus' message on those who had been told all their lives that they were excluded. As Jesus' message comes loudly and clearly through these three stories that you and I really matter to God. Look with me at how Jesus explains this life-changing truth, because in each of these three stories, something of great value has gone missing. In the first story, a sheep, a lost sheep, meant a great deal in terms of worth to a shepherd in Jesus' day. In the second story, we know that a lost coin would have mattered a great deal to this widow, as it probably represented a large proportion of her inheritance. And it goes without saying that a lost child means everything to a parent. This story of the lost son always reminds me of a day when we lost one of our children a number of years ago in a local park. And the sense of anguish and anxiety that sense of separation brings from the child that you love. And how we couldn't rest until one of our children was found safe and well. I believe that kind of anguish takes us a little closer to the heart of the living God, who's portrayed here in these three stories by Jesus, firstly as a shepherd, and secondly as a woman, and then thirdly as a father, as Jesus redefines the character and the heart of God to those who'd been told by the religious leaders of their day that they were excluded. where we start to see something of the dignity and the value and the worth of all those who've been made in the image of God. That sense of value is spelled out here by the determination to seek until what has gone missing has been found. It's an all-out search. As the shepherd in verse 4 safely leaves the rest of the sheep and keeps on searching until the missing sheep is found. And the woman in verse 8 gets down on her hands and knees and searches inch by inch and doesn't stop until the missing coin has been found. And then in this powerful picture of the running father in verse 20 who longs and waits and watches day after day, hoping for the safe return of his son. This sense of all-out search and rescue is designed by Jesus to show us how much lost people really matter to God. That's why people were gathering around Jesus. He welcomes sinners and he eats with them. Because this invitation to faith in Jesus is open to everyone. And these three little stories are designed by Jesus to reflect the heart of the living God for people like you and me. Without a relationship with God, we are all spiritually lost. And lost people really matter to God. And finally, we discover in these stories that when lost people are found, all of heaven begins to celebrate. There probably hasn't been a great deal for us to celebrate in recent months, has there? Due to the restrictions of lockdown and social distancing. Birthdays and other celebrations have been rather muted affairs. We've been unable to celebrate in the way that we normally might. My own mum, who lives on her own through this crisis, was 85 last Saturday, and it was impossible to celebrate with her in the way that we would like to have done. But the recent lifting of restrictions has given us tastes and glimpses and foretastes of what it's going to be like when we can finally get back together again. And it's lovely to hear of plans being made for a national day of coming together on the 4th and 5th of July. And you can't miss the notes of celebration that brings each of these three stories to an end here in Luke chapter 15, verse 5. Let's throw a party. The missing sheep's been found. Let's celebrate, verse 8. I've found this coin that means so much to me. Verse 22, let's put on a celebration feast. Let's call the neighbours. Let's bring in our family. Let's call the local community to celebrate with us. And as Jesus makes it clear, every time that someone comes to faith, a celebration breaks out in heaven. Verse 10, Luke, we hear the words of Jesus. In the same way, I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. As something of heaven touches earth, as someone who is spiritually lost is found, as someone who's been told that they are excluded is now included, as someone who's been told that they are without value is given worth and dignity, as God's in God's kingdom, as a little more of God's kingdom comes on earth, as we've been thinking recently. This chapter begins with the sinners and the tax collectors muttering, which makes this theme of joy and celebration that runs through these lost and found stories even more striking, as God himself comes to seek and save those who are lost. And unlike the hardened heart of the religious leaders, all of heaven breaks out in celebration when sinners are reached and found. My friends, the story of the Christian faith is of a God who comes to us. It is not we who find God, it is God who finds us. Jesus came to turn people's search for God on its head. Every other religion on earth says we can search and find God if only we try hard enough or we find the right route. No, says Jesus, God comes to us. Salvation comes to us through grace and not through our own achievements. And the lesson for these religious leaders that day was that Jesus welcomes sinners and eats with them. And so this morning, here is the first part of Jesus' answer to the grumblings and the mutterings of the religious leaders of his day, the ones who thought they had the monopoly on God. No wonder people gathered around Jesus, the great shepherd of the sheep, who knew that he was going to have to die in order to bring lost people like you and me home. Or in the words of Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 2, for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame. A joy in bringing lost people home that was so great that Jesus was willing to endure the cross. We began this morning by gazing on the homecoming of the prodigal son, a story that, as Tim Keller puts it, shines a light on the central, beautiful message of Jesus, the gospel of grace, hope, and salvation. And a story that we're going to unpack together over these coming Sundays. Our friends, this morning is just a taster. It's a taster of where we're going in the coming weeks as we place these lost and found stories back into their original setting as these two diverse groups of religious and irreligious people gather around Jesus. So let me return to the question that we began with this morning. Are you a participant or an observer when it comes to the message of Jesus Christ? In some powerful words of personal testimony, Henry Nouwen describes his own story of being lost and found through the story of the prodigal son as he writes these words. After my long self-exposing journey, the tender embrace of father and son expressed everything I desired at that moment. I was indeed the son exhausted from long travels. I wanted to be embraced. I was looking for a home where I could feel safe. The son come home was all I was and all I wanted to be. For so long I had been going from place to place. Now I desired only to rest safely in a place where I could feel a sense of belonging, a place where I could feel at home. My friends, that's what these lost and found stories are all about. Powerful stories that speak to our hearts as much as our minds. So let me ask you as we conclude this morning, what do you most need to hear from God's word this morning? Maybe you need to hear again that God comes in search of us. Maybe you can identify with that sense of being spiritually lost. As many of you will know, I often love to quote the words of Augustine, one of the early church fathers, who describes his own experience of being lost and found in these words, where he says, God, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. The message of Jesus is that he has come to seek and to save those who are lost. Millions of people across our world think that by believing and obeying God's law in the Bible, they can find God. The biblical gospel turns that sense of thinking on its head because we cannot save ourselves. It's by grace you are saved and not by works, so that no one can boast. So let me ask you very gently this morning, are you willing to be found by God? Our vision, our calling as a church is about helping everyone to follow Jesus. Do get in touch with us if you would like to explore this further. Maybe you need to hear that you really matter to God. In these challenging days of Black Lives Matter, where inequalities that have existed for generations, where racial abuse and miscarriages of justice are being rightly brought into the light, the message of Jesus Christ comes loudly and clearly in these verses. You and I deeply matter to God. That regardless of race or colour or gender or culture or background, you are deeply loved by God. A love and a value and a dignity that belongs to all who've been made in the image of God. And that is something that we've been called to work for with all of our resolve. And finally, maybe it's time we reminded ourselves of the message that we've been called to share. That the invitation at the way back to God is open to all who will believe. There are no exceptions. The religious leaders of Jesus' day had put together a very tidy religious system that divided people very neatly into good and bad. Which is why this invitation from Jesus consistently attracted and gathered the outsiders and the marginalized and the sinners and the tax collectors and people who knew they hadn't got it all together. And it was an invitation that seemed to offend the Bible-believing religious people of Jesus' day. As we prepare to unpack this great parable of the prodigal son in coming weeks, I want to leave you with these really challenging words from Tim Keller. If the preaching of our ministers and the practice of our parishioners do not have the same effect on people that Jesus had, then we must not be declaring the same message that Jesus did. If our churches aren't appealing to younger brothers, they must be more full of elder brothers than we'd like to think. Really challenging words for us to reflect on as we conclude this morning. So may God bless you as you head out into another new week.